Good morning, it's April 2nd, and this is To My Liberal Friends. Well, yesterday was the first rounds of the 2026 midterm elections, and the media hyped them as a referendum on Donald Trump. Democratic leadership, such that it is, followed suit and said they're going to send a signal to the public that people were disenchanted with Trump and that they, the Democrats, were going to turn the tide. In Florida, there were two special elections being held. They were due to Congressman Mike Waltz being selected as the National Security Advisor and Congressman Matt Gaetz being nominated as Attorney General. Gaetz resigned from Congress immediately after the nomination and eventually had to withdraw as that nominee because of his own personal sexual scandals. In the Florida 6th District, the Democrats thought they had a chance. They poured just over $10 million into the race, backing a public school employee, Josh Weil, over Florida State Senator Randy Fine. This gave Weil a 10-to-1 spending advantage. Sounds like Kamala Harris against Trump. The result was that Fine won the race comfortably with just under 57%. Now that's a landslide by any definition, but Democrats will point out that Waltz had won the race by 30 points instead of the 16 that Fine won by. Well, don't be fooled by that gilding of the lily. Last year was a presidential election. That means voter turnout was much higher. Last night, the total voters in Florida 6 race was just under 200,000. In November, that same district had over 400,000 voters. And that's typical of most special elections. In his next race, Randy Fine will win convincingly in 2026, and Democrats will ignore that race financially. Over in the Florida 1st District, the Democrats again decided to spend a lot of money backing Gay Valmont, a liberal Democratic activist, and challenged Jimmy Patronis, who had been the chief financial officer in the state of Florida. Once again, the margin of victory was less than what former Congressman Matt Gaetz had put, but Patronis cruised to victory with about 57%. In 2026, he will easily top the 60% mark. Voter turnout was about 170,000 compared to over 400,000 last November. Again, that's typical of any special election. What you hear from Democrats in the media is that Republicans underperformed, that they will spin that as anti-Trump. But in both of these House districts, they will ignore the Democratic candidate in 2026 because they know they're solidly Republican, and despite pouring millions of dollars into these two special elections, in the end they came up empty. Now, I don't want to burst their bubble, but Democrats should realize that Florida remains a solidly Republican state, and those two districts are what most would call ruby red. These two elections gave Speaker Mike Johnson some breathing room, with a current majority of 220 to 213. The two vacant seats are strong Democrat seats in Arizona and Texas, so eventually that number will be a 5-seat margin. Well, up in Wisconsin, the news was not as good for Trump, but it was more of a split decision. In the most important race, the Democrats found a victory in a supposedly nonpartisan race for the state Supreme Court. Susan Crawford easily defeated Brad Shamil by a margin of 55 to 45. This gives the liberals a 4-3 majority on the state Supreme Court, and while it will be critically important when redistricting lawsuits eventually come before the court, some experts say it could swing 2 seats to Democrats. The voting was expected in an off-year election, with about 2.3 million voters coming in compared to 3.5 in the election last November. The other issue on the ballot in Wisconsin dealt with voter ID. By an even larger margin, 63% to 37%, voters agreed to amend the Wisconsin Constitution to require photo identification in order to vote. Now, Wisconsin law already required this by statute, but now it's enshrined in the state constitution, and that makes it extremely difficult for Democrats to remove this requirement, either by the liberal majority of the state Supreme Court or the legislature. Voter ID is a hot-button issue around the country, with Republicans urging it be required, while Democrats have opposed it. Their position, again, rings hollow. They've said that it discriminates against the elderly and the minorities that might not have such ID. It's an insult to those people. In several states, they've enacted a variety of ID requirements to meet the law. In Georgia, for example, they have upwards of 10 ways to validate your identity, and still Democrats oppose them. My final point today deals with Elon Musk. Musk was in Wisconsin campaigning on the court election. He spent, by some reports, about $20 million. He donated a significant amount of money. He even passed out 2 $1 million checks to voters. Well, Musk has become a flashpoint for Democrats, and they're attacking him at every chance. He's identified as the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, and in my opinion, he's become a negative to the Trump administration. Donald Trump himself suggested this week that eventually Musk will return to running his companies. And this is a hint that even Trump is starting to realize that Musk could become more of a liability than an asset. The DOGE team is in place, and if Musk were to remove himself and it would still go on with the work of rooting out government waste, fraud, and abuse. but they would become faceless bureaucrats like all the other federal workers, and Democrats would lose the face of their attacks. In a poll this week by the Harvard-Harris group, they asked the following question, quote, do you think Democrats should oppose the effort to reduce government expenditures or join in the mission of cutting government waste? A full 61% of respondents, including 37% of Democrats, want Democrats to help cut government waste. On another question, 68% of respondents, including majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, said the current level of U.S. federal government debt is unsustainable. An even more important question, and barometer of how the public feels, was this question. Quote, to reduce the budget deficits, do you think we mostly need to reduce government expenditures or to increase taxes? End quote. An overwhelming 79% of respondents, including large majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, choose reducing government expenditures, the primary answer. Wow, they're getting it. Another Harvard-Harris question, do you think that the government expenditures are basically fair and reasonable? Do you think they're filled with waste, fraud, and efficiency? Over 63% of the respondents selected the latter. That is why I say remove the flashpoint and allow DOGE to continue its mission, because the public wants government spending cut. This has been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.